A mountain man rescued a teenage girl from child labor, but what he did next shocked everyone. Snow falls on a frozen mining camp. The sound of chains rattles, a whip cracks, and a young girl stumbles under the weight of firewood. Out of the shadows steps a lone mountain man, scarred, silent, but unwilling to walk away. With one swing of his knife, he cuts her free. But freedom has a price. The saloon keeper waves a contract. The marshal rattles his jail keys. The church bell tolls as whispers spread. Is he protector or outlaw? By firelight, the girl reads from her mother's Bible, softening the mountain man's hardened heart. Then comes the shocking twist. Hidden land, stolen children, and a town forced to choose between law and true justice. Thundering hooves, a cabin in flames, a preacher's trembling voice, and one girl's desperate cry, "Don't send me back." Will a solitary mountain man be enough to stand against corruption and claim the family he never thought he'd have? Or will the frontier swallow them both whole? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter winter wind howled through the mining camp's empty streets, cutting through Gideon Holt's buckskin coat as he made his way down from his mountain shack. His arms were laden with beaver and fox pelts, ready for trading. The morning sun barely touched the peaked roofs of the rough-built structures, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. The usual sounds of the camp, pickaxes striking stone, mules braying, men shouting, were oddly absent this early morning. Instead, a sharp crack split the air. Gideon's steps faltered. That sound, he knew it well, the bite of a whip. Another crack echoed, followed by a muffled cry that made his chest tighten. He quickened his pace, boots crunching in the packed snow. As he rounded the corner by the general store, he saw her. A girl, no more than 14 or 15, struggled under a heavy load of firewood. Chains rattled with each painful step, binding her thin wrists to a wagon tongue. Her dress, threadbare and patched, offered little protection against the brutal cold. Blood stained the snow where her raw hands gripped the rough-hewn logs. "Move faster, girl!" The saloon keeper, Reed Morton, stood nearby, whip coiled in his meaty fist. "Them stoves won't feed themselves." Gideon's weathered fingers found the bone handle of his hunting knife. He'd spent years alone in these mountains, choosing solitude over the company of men after losing his Sarah and their infant son. He'd told himself their affairs weren't his concern anymore. But this stirred something deep inside him, something he thought long buried. The girl stumbled, logs scattering. She tried to catch herself, but the chains jerked her down hard. Morton raised the whip again. "That's enough." Gideon's voice carried the quiet authority of a man used to being heard, even after years of speaking mainly to himself and his traps. Morton's head snapped around. "This ain't your business, Holt." The girl's indentured fair and square. "Her own uncle sold her papers to me." Gideon moved closer, taking in the girl's frightened eyes, the bruises visible beneath her torn sleeve. "Ain't nothing fair about this." His knife flashed in the weak morning light as he strode forward. "You cut those chains! You're stealing my property!" Morton's face reddened. "I'll have the law on you." Gideon didn't pause. The sharp blade made quick work of the chains, links falling to the snow. The girl swayed, barely able to stand. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms, her body frighteningly light against his chest. A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by Morton's shouting. Muttered curses and dark looks followed Gideon as he carried the girl away from the camp. He felt her trembling, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "Don't send me back." Her whisper was barely audible, a breath against his coat. "Please." Something in her voice, the raw desperation of it, reached past his carefully built walls. It reminded him of Sarah, of promises made and broken. He tightened his hold, sheltering her from the bitter wind. "You're safe now, child," he he murmured. "Ain't nobody sending you back." The trek up to his cabin seemed longer than usual, each step careful on the snowy path. The girl, he still didn't know her name, had fallen silent, but her grip on his coat never loosened. As they climbed higher, the sounds of the camp faded away, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the occasional cry of a winter bird. Dusk was settling by the time they reached his cabin. It wasn't much, a simple one-room structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, but it was solid and warm. The girl had begun shivering again as he shouldered open the door. Inside, he gently laid her on his narrow bunk. In the growing darkness, he could see her eyes tracking his movements as he moved to light the old brass lantern that hung from a ceiling beam. The warm glow revealed her face clearly for the first time. She was young, younger than he'd first thought. Dirt and exhaustion couldn't hide the delicate features that spoke of better days. Her hair, matted and tangled now, might have been golden once. But it was her eyes that caught him, wide and wary, yet holding a spark of something that surprised him. Hope, maybe. Or trust. "I'm Annie Mae," she whispered. "Annie Mae Callahan." Gideon nodded, busying himself with stirring the banked coals in the fireplace. "Gideon Holt," he replied gruffly. Looking at her huddled form on his bunk, he realized with sudden clarity that this moment had changed everything. By cutting those chains, he'd bound himself to her fate as surely as if he'd forged new ones. He added wood to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. The familiar solitude of his cabin felt different now, charged with both possibility and responsibility. Annie Mae's breathing had steadied, exhaustion finally claiming her. In the lantern light, her sleeping face looked peaceful, years of hardship momentarily smoothed away. Gideon settled into his old chair, keeping watch as night descended outside. The wind still howled, but it seemed less bitter now, less lonely. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Morton wouldn't let this go easily, and a mountain man's cabin was no place for a young girl. But for now, she was safe. For now, that was enough. The lantern flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Gideon pulled his coat tighter and continued his vigil, listening to Annie Mae's soft breathing mix with the crackle of the fire. Something long dormant stirred in his heart, a feeling he'd thought forever lost in the graves of his wife and child. Protection. Purpose. Perhaps even hope. In the lantern's glow, Gideon rummaged through his meager supplies, gathering what he needed to tend Annie Mae's wounds. The girl sat quietly on the edge of his bunk, her shoulders hunched against pain and memories. From a weathered trunk, he pulled clean rags and a small jar of pine and yarrow salve he'd made last summer. "Let me see your hands, child." His gruff voice was gentler than usual as he settled on an old stool before her. Annie Mae hesitantly extended her hands, palms up. The chains had left angry welts around her wrists, and splinters from the firewood had torn her palms raw. Gideon's jaw tightened at the sight, but he kept his movements slow and careful as he began cleaning the wounds. "Might sting some," he warned, applying the salve. Annie Mae didn't flinch, though her breath caught slightly. As he wrapped clean bandages around her wrists, she watched his weathered hands work with quiet fascination. "Thank you, Mr. Holt," she whispered. "Gideon'll do." He stood, moving to the hearth where a pot of venison stew simmered. "When's the last time you ate proper?" She considered this, forehead creasing. "Yesterday morning, I think. Mr. Morton said I hadn't earned supper." Gideon ladled stew into a tin bowl, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. He handed it to her, along with a piece of cornbread. "Eat slow now. Don't want it coming back up." Annie Mae took small, careful bites, as if afraid the food might disappear. The cabin fell quiet, except for the pop of the fire and the winter wind's moan. Gideon waited, knowing there was more to her story, but patient as any tracker reading sign. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mama died 2 winters past. Consumption took her. She stared into her bowl. Papa was already gone. Mining accident when I was little. Uncle Thomas. She swallowed hard. He drinks. Said he couldn't feed another mouth. Sold my papers to Mr. Morton for 3 bottles of whiskey and a month's credit at the saloon. Gideon's hands clenched, but he kept his voice steady. How long you been with Morton? Since first frost. Her fingers traced the rim of the bowl. He said I'd work off the debt in 2 years, be free when I turn 18. But the debt keeps growing. For food, for the dress he gave me for breaking a glass last week. Her voice cracked. To Gideon's surprise, she straightened her shoulders and began reciting softly. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. The familiar words of the 23rd Psalm filled the cabin, and Gideon felt something crack in his chest. How long had it been since he'd heard scripture spoken aloud? Since Sarah, Mama taught me, Annie Mae explained, catching his expression. Said God's words would comfort when nothing else could. Dawn found them both still awake. Annie Mae insisted on helping, despite her bandaged hands, taking up Gideon's worn broom with trembling determination. He watched her sweep, noting how she favored her right side. More bruises he couldn't see, likely. We need to settle this properly, he said finally. Can't hide up here forever? Annie Mae's hands tightened on the broom handle, but she nodded. They made their way down to the camp as morning light spilled over the mountains. The streets were busier now, miners heading to their claims, merchants opening shops. Every eye followed them. Morton burst out of the saloon as they passed, face purple with rage. There's my property! Marshal! Marshal Pike! The marshal emerged from his office, looking tired and uncomfortable. A small crowd gathered as Morton thrust a paper at Pike. Here's the contract, signed legal. She's bound to me until 18, says right here. Morton jabbed his finger at the document. This mountain man's guilty of kidnapping. Gideon studied the contract. The signature at the bottom was shaky. Thomas Callahan's drunken scrawl. His lip curled in disgust. Ain't right, he growled. She's a child, not property. Marshal Pike rubbed his jaw. Law's clear on this, Holt. Indenture contract's binding. Girl has to go back or you're facing charges. Annie Mae pressed closer to Gideon's side, trembling. He felt her fear like a physical thing, but beneath it was trust. Trust he hadn't earned but couldn't bear to break. His mind raced, then settled on a decision. Without a word, he took Annie Mae's arm and strode toward the small white church at the edge of camp. The crowd followed, muttering. Inside, early morning light filtered through plain glass windows. Reverend Matthews looked up from his Bible, startled at the interruption. Reverend, Gideon's voice filled the empty church. I'm claiming this girl as my ward under God's law. Higher than any man's paper. The congregation gathering for morning prayers fell silent. Annie Mae's eyes went wide. Morton spluttered from the doorway. You can't. Can and am. Gideon's voice was steel. You want to argue with the Almighty about it? Reverend Matthews looked between Gideon's weathered face and Annie Mae's hopeful one. The preacher knew Gideon's story. Everyone did. The hermit who'd lost his family and faith, who hadn't set foot in church since burying his wife and child. Yet here he stood, one hand protective on Annie Mae's shoulder, challenging not just Morton, but his own isolation. The silence stretched taut as a fiddle string. Finally, the preacher nodded slowly. The church recognizes your claim of guardianship, mister. Holt May. God guide your path forward. A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Morton opened his mouth to protest, but Marshal Pike put a hand on his arm, shaking his head slightly. The law of God, spoken in his house, carried weight even in a rough mining camp. Annie Mae's bandaged hand found Gideon's calloused one. He squeezed it gently, feeling the weight of what he'd done settle around his shoulders like a familiar coat. He'd made his stand, chosen his ground. There'd be consequences, but looking down at Annie Mae's grateful face, he knew he'd chosen right. The morning sun streamed through the windows, painting patterns on the rough wooden floor. In that light, Gideon saw not just Annie Mae's hope, but a reflection of his own redemption. The walls he'd built around his heart since Sarah's death hadn't just cracked, they'd crumbled entirely, making room for something new. Something that felt suspiciously like family. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-laden branches in pale gold. Gideon stood at his cabin window, watching the first threads of smoke rise from the mining camp below. His jaw tightened as he turned to Annie Mae, who sat wrapped in a quilt by the hearth. "Can't stay here," he said quietly. "Morton'll have the marshal up here soon enough, law papers in hand." Annie Mae's fingers clutched the quilt tighter, but she nodded bravely. "Where will we go?" "Got some places I know. High country's safer till things settle." Gideon moved purposefully around the cabin, gathering supplies. He pulled dried venison jerky from his stores and rolled several thick wool blankets. "Ever rode a mule before?" "No, sir," Annie Mae admitted, but she was already folding the quilt she'd slept under, ready to help. "Old Bess is steady enough. She'll treat you kind if you do the same." He checked her bandaged hands, noting with approval they weren't bleeding through. "Think you can hold reins?" Annie Mae flexed her fingers carefully. "Yes, I reckon so." Within the hour, they were mounted on Bess, Annie Mae perched in front with Gideon behind, their supplies secured behind the saddle. The mule picked her way carefully up the snow-dusted trail, breath steaming in the cold morning air. Annie Mae sat straight-backed, despite her injuries, taking in everything with quiet intensity. They rode until mid-morning, following a narrow deer trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. Finally, Gideon guided them to a sheltered hollow near a frozen creek. The overhanging rocks would block the worst of the wind, and thick evergreens provided cover from prying eyes below. "This'll do," he said, helping Annie Mae down. Her legs were shaky from the ride, but she immediately began gathering dry twigs for a fire. Gideon watched her determined efforts, something warming in his chest despite the bitter cold. After they'd eaten some jerky and melted snow for drinking water, Gideon pulled a length of wire from his pack. "Time you learned something useful. Come here." Annie Mae came closer, curious, as he began fashioning a simple snare. "Watch close now," he instructed. "Rabbit runs follow these paths through the snow. See the tracks?" She nodded, leaning in to study his hands as he demonstrated how to set the wire loop. "Now you try," he said, offering her a fresh piece. Her bandaged fingers fumbled at first, but she persisted, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Gideon guided her hands patiently, showing her how to anchor the snare and disguise it with leaves. "There," he said when she'd finally managed one on her own. "That's right, fine work." Her face lit up at the praise, making her look more her age than the haunted child he'd found in chains. They set 3 more snares before darkness fell, then huddled close to their small fire. Gideon insisted Annie Mae take both blankets, ignoring her protests. "Sleep," he told her gruffly. "I'll keep watch." Through the long night, he sat with his back against a boulder, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind's moan and the distant cry of coyotes. Annie Mae slept fitfully at first, but gradually her breathing deepened into the peaceful rhythm of exhausted youth. 3 days they spent in that hollow, checking snares and gathering firewood. Annie Mae proved a quick study, learning to move quietly through the woods and spot animal sign. But their food was running low, and the cold was taking its toll. On the morning of the 4th day, Gideon made the hard decision to return to town. They rode down as the sun cleared the peaks. To Gideon's surprise, several women from the mining camp were waiting near his cabin. Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, stepped forward with a covered basket. "Found these extra biscuits," she said meaningfully, pressing the warm basket into Annie Mae's hands. "Thought you might have need?" Other women nodded, though they darted nervous glances toward town. One squeezed Annie Mae's shoulder before hurrying away. The girl's eyes welled with grateful tears as she breathed in the smell of fresh baked bread. But not all support was so open. As they walked through town later, Gideon's sharp ears caught the whispers. "Ain't natural, him keeping her up there alone? What's a mountain man want with a young girl? Ought to be with proper folk." The mutters followed them all the way to Sunday service. Gideon hadn't planned to attend, but Annie Mae's quiet request had him reluctantly donning his one clean shirt. They sat near the back, aware of the sideways glances. Halfway through the first hymn, a young Ute woman slipped into their pew. Gideon recognized her as Tala Nez, who sometimes traded herbs in town. To his surprise, she leaned close to Annie Mae and began whispering in English. "I see your wounds healing," she murmured. "I too know what it is to be treated as property. The trading post man." She touched her own wrist briefly. "But there are good people who help. Like your mountain father here." Annie Mae's face softened with understanding, and something passed between the two women. A recognition of shared pain, but also of survival. Tala squeezed Annie Mae's hand gently before rising to leave after the service. They hadn't made it 3 steps from the church door when Marshal Pike intercepted them, his weather-lined face grave. "Holt," he said quietly. "A word." Gideon moved Annie Mae behind him slightly, but nodded for the marshal to continue. "Morton's got the territorial judge's ear," Pike said. "Law's clear on indenture contracts. They'll send men to take her back, and I won't be able to stop them." He paused, conflict evident in his eyes. "You're playing outlaw here, Holt. Ain't gonna end well." Gideon's hand tightened protectively on Annie Mae's shoulder. He felt her trembling, but she pressed closer to his side, trusting him to keep her safe. The weight of that trust sat heavy on his heart. "Law ain't always right," Gideon replied evenly. "God's law says protect the innocent. That's what I aim to do." Pike shook his head sadly. "Just giving fair warning. When they come?" He left the threat unfinished, touching his hat brim before walking away. Gideon stood still for a long moment, feeling Annie Mae's shoulder under his hand, hearing Tala's quiet footsteps as she passed behind them. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the churchyard snow. A tall man, a young girl, and a native woman, their paths unexpectedly entwined. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. He wouldn't let them take her back to chains, not while there was breath in his body. The law might call him outlaw, but his conscience was clear before God. "Come on, child," he said gently. "Let's get you home." Annie Mae's answering smile warmed him more than any fire could. Whatever came next, they would face it together. A week of uneasy peace had settled over the mining camp when Gideon decided they needed supplies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground as he and Annie Mae made their way down from the cabin. Tala Nez waited for them at the edge of town, her calm presence like a shield against the sideways glances of townsfolk. "Good morning, little sister," Tala greeted Annie Mae warmly, falling into step beside them. The girl's face brightened at the familiar term of kinship. Inside Jensen's Mercantile, Annie Mae helped Gideon select basic provisions: flour, coffee, salt. Her bandaged hands were healing well enough to grip items carefully. While Gideon haggled over ammunition prices, Annie Mae's attention drifted to a stack of papers near the counter. She froze, her fingers hovering over a yellowed document. "Mister." "Gideon," she whispered. That's my mama's name." Gideon moved closer, squinting at the faded writing. Sure enough, Elizabeth Callahan was clearly visible on what appeared to be an old deed. Tala peered at the paper. "This should go to the preacher," she said firmly. "He keeps the town records, knows the old claims." Gideon nodded slowly, tucking the document inside his coat. They paid for their supplies and walked quickly to the small church, where Preacher Mills was sweeping the front steps. "Well now," the preacher said, adjusting his spectacles as he examined the deed in his study. "This appears genuine, recorded at the land office in 1872. He traced the official seal with his finger. 40 acres, good bottomland along the river, about 3 miles east. Never claimed, but the title's clear enough." Annie Mae's eyes grew wide. "That was Mama's? Then it's mine, now?" "By rights, yes," the preacher confirmed. "Your mother's only heir." "A home," Annie Mae breathed, wonder in her voice. "Our own home." Gideon watched emotion play across her face, hope blooming like spring flowers after winter. His own heart twisted strangely, remembering another young woman's dreams of home long ago. But their discovery didn't stay secret long. Before they'd left the church, heavy boots thundered on the steps. The saloon-keeper, Morton, burst in, face red with rage. "So this is your game, Holt," he shouted. "Using the girl to steal property now?" "That land was promised to me." "By who?" Gideon's voice was dangerously quiet. "Show us your claim." Morton's face purpled. "Everyone knows that river bottom's meant for my new saloon. Been planning it 2 years. "The deed says different," Preacher Mills interjected mildly. "This is legally recorded." "Legal," Morton spat. "Nothing legal about kidnapping a bound servant, Marshal." Pike appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "What's all this?" "Theft is what it is." Morton jabbed a finger at the deed. "Holt's trying to steal my expansion plans through this girl. I demand you arrest him." The marshal removed his hat, running fingers through graying hair. "Can't arrest a man for finding a legal deed," he said slowly. "But there's questions need answering. Property rights, guardianship, that indenture contract." He straightened. "We'll have a proper hearing. 3 days from now, 10 o'clock. All parties present their case." 3 days, Morton sneered. "Time enough for them to run." "We'll be here," Gideon said firmly. Annie Mae pressed close to his side, trembling slightly. Tala, who had watched silently, spoke up. "I will testify about the girl's treatment and the law regarding indentured children." Morton stormed out, slamming the church door. The marshal lingered. "Holt," he said quietly, "you're pushing awful hard against the current here." "Current's wrong sometimes," Gideon replied. "Man's got to stand." Pike shook his head. 3 days, he repeated, and left. The walk back to the cabin was tense, all of them alert for followers. But once safely inside, Annie Mae's excitement bubbled over. "Mr. Gideon," she said, spreading the deed carefully on his rough table. "There's a creek runs through that bottomland. We could plant gardens there, fresh vegetables in summer." Her fingers traced the property lines. "Maybe keep chickens, too." And she hesitated. "Maybe even build a proper schoolhouse someday, for other children who need learning." Gideon sat heavily in his chair, watching her face glow in the lamplight. The fear of losing her gnawed at his gut. Morton had influence, money, friends in territorial government. But seeing her plan and dream, he felt something he hadn't known in years. Purpose. This wasn't just about protecting one girl anymore. It was about building something lasting, something good. The kind of home his Sarah had always wanted before fever took her and their infant son. "Mr. Gideon?" Annie Mae's voice was smaller now. "You're awful quiet." He cleared his throat. "Just thinking on what needs doing. Garden soil'll need turning come spring. Chicken coop wants good solid walls, keep foxes out." Her smile could have lit the whole cabin. "You'll help? You'll stay?" Ain't going nowhere, he assured her gruffly. Got to teach you proper fence building, don't I? Tala, who had been brewing tea at the hearth, brought them each a steaming cup. The land remembers, she said softly. It knows when it's loved right. This ground has waited for healing hands. They sat together in the warm lamplight, three unlikely allies bound by something stronger than law or custom. Annie Mae kept touching the deed gently, as if afraid it might vanish. Gideon pretended to study the document's details, but really he was watching her, memorizing the hope in her eyes. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, in this moment, he allowed himself to share her dreams of home. The church hall filled quickly on hearing day, wooden benches creaking under the weight of what seemed like half the mining camp. Cold morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting pale squares across the floor where Annie Mae stood beside Gideon. Her thin shoulders were straight, despite her trembling hands. Marshal Pike sat at a table near the pulpit, several law books spread before him. The saloon-keeper, Morton, had claimed the front row, his expensive coat a stark contrast to Gideon's worn buckskins. Tala sat quietly in the back, her dark eyes watchful. "This hearing will come to order," Pike announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. "We're here to settle matters of guardianship and property rights concerning Annie Mae Callahan." Morton surged to his feet, waving a paper. "I have a legal contract right here, signed by her uncle, giving me custody until she turns 18. "That's a forgery," Gideon's deep voice rumbled through the hall. "Written on paper that weren't even made when it claims to be signed." The marshal leaned forward. "What evidence you got of that, Holt?" "Look at the watermark," Gideon pointed. "That paper mill didn't start operating till last spring. Contracts dated 2 years ago." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Morton's face reddened. "The date's wrong, then. But the agreement stands." "My uncle was drunk," Annie Mae's voice quavered at first, then strengthened. "He'd been drinking for days. He traded me for 3 bottles of whiskey, but he had no right. Mama never made him my guardian. She wouldn't want this." "The girl's right." Preacher Mills stood, Bible in hand. "I knew Elizabeth Callahan. She was a God-fearing woman who wanted better for her daughter than servitude." The preacher opened his Bible, fingers finding a marked passage. "Moreover, Scripture is clear on this matter. Exodus 21, verse 16 states, 'Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death.' The Lord's word leaves no room for binding children against his will." "This ain't about Scripture," Morton sneered. "It's about law and property rights." "A child ain't property." Gideon's voice was deadly quiet. Several women in the crowd nodded firmly. Pike rubbed his temples. "This goes beyond local authority. There's territorial statutes about indentures, and that deed of Annie Mae's needs proper review." He straightened in his chair. "I'm postponing final judgment until territorial authorities can examine all documents. Meanwhile, temporary custody stays as is. The girl remains Holt's ward." "This is an outrage," Morton slammed his fist on the bench. "You're letting a mountain hermit and a slip of a girl make fools of us all." He jabbed a finger at Annie Mae. "That land is meant for progress, for business, not some orphan's fantasy farm." "The hearing is adjourned," Pike's voice cut through Morton's tirade. "My decision stands." Morton stormed out, boots thundering on the wooden steps. His face promised revenge. The crowd slowly dispersed, many offering quiet words of support to Annie Mae as they passed. "You did well," Tala told her, squeezing her hand. "Standing tall for truth is never easy." The winter afternoon was already fading when they reached Gideon's cabin. Dark clouds threatened snow, and the roof had developed a worrying sag over the kitchen corner. "Need to shore that up before the storm hits," Gideon muttered, eyeing the roof. "Them boards won't hold much more weight." "I can help," Annie Mae offered quickly. "Mama taught me about fixing things. Said a woman needs to know how to keep her home strong." Gideon's weathered face softened. "Reckon she was right about that." They worked together as the wind picked up, Gideon showing Annie Mae how to properly nail support beams while he replaced rotted shingles. Despite the serious work, her natural brightness began to shine through, when a gust of wind sent loose straw from the old roof swirling around them like snow. Annie Mae's laugh rang out, clear and pure as a bell. Gideon paused in his hammering, struck by the sound. It transformed her whole face, chasing away the shadows of fear that had haunted her eyes since he'd found her chained in the street. For a moment, she was simply a young girl helping with chores, safe and happy. Something warm stirred in his chest, an emotion he'd thought long buried with Sarah and their infant son. Paternal instinct, he realized, the fierce need to protect and nurture. He'd been so long without family, wearing his solitude like armor. Now this slip of a girl had somehow worked her way past his defenses. They finished the roof as dusk settled, the cabin glowing with lamplight and wood smoke. Annie Mae hummed softly while she stirred their supper, moving around the kitchen as if she'd always belonged there. "Think we did good work today," she said, setting a bowl of beans and cornbread before him. "The roof, I mean. And at the hearing, too." "You showed real courage," Gideon agreed. "Ain't easy speaking truth when folks want to shout you down." She ducked her head, pleased. "Having you there helped. Makes me feel safe, knowing somebody's standing with me." Gideon was about to respond when movement caught his eye through the window. Shadows shifted against the trees, men's shapes moving with deliberate stealth. He recognized Morton's bulk among them and the gleam of weapons. His expression must have changed, because Annie Mae went very still. "Mr. Gideon, what is it?" "Nothing to fret about," he said calmly, though his mind was racing. "Just finish your supper." But they both knew trouble was circling closer, like wolves around a homestead. Morton's hired men were watching, waiting. The hearing had only bought them time, not safety. Annie Mae's hands trembled slightly as she cleared their bowls, but her voice was steady. "We'll face it together, won't we? Whatever comes." Gideon watched the shadows outside, remembering her courage at the hearing. She deserved more than running and hiding. She deserved a real home where she could laugh without fear. "Together," he agreed quietly. "That's a promise." The lamp flickered, casting their shadows on the wall. A tall man and a slight girl, yet somehow matching in determination. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the watchers' tracks. But inside the cabin, warmth held against the gathering storm. Dawn broke pale and brittle over the Colorado mountains. Frost etched delicate patterns on the cabin windows, where Gideon and Annie Mae finished their morning coffee. The girl had taken to rising early, matching his mountain habits without complaint. "Need kindling before this weather turns," Gideon said, studying the heavy sky. "Might as well teach you proper wood gathering while we're at it." Annie Mae nodded eagerly, wrapping her threadbare shawl tighter. One of the church ladies had promised her a proper winter coat, but for now, she made do. Gideon frowned at her thin clothes, then shrugged off his buckskin jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "But you'll be cold," she protested. "Been through worse," he said gruffly. "Besides, working keeps a body warm." They headed into the timber, Gideon showing her how to spot the driest deadfall. His axe made quick work of larger branches while Annie Mae gathered smaller pieces. The familiar routine of work settled between them comfortably. "My mama used to sing when we gathered wood," Annie Mae said softly, breaking their companionable silence. "Said it made the time pass quicker." Gideon's hands stilled on the axe handle. "Reckon you could sing too if you've a mind to." Her clear voice rose hesitantly at first, then stronger, an old hymn about shelter in storms. The sound carried through the crisp morning air, startling a pair of jays into flight. Gideon found himself humming along, surprising them both. The morning passed quickly. When their arms were full of kindling, they started back toward the cabin. But something made Gideon pause at the tree line. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered latching it. "Stay here," he told Annie Mae sharply, setting down his wood. She clutched her bundle tighter, eyes wide as he drew his hunting knife and approached the cabin. The destruction inside hit like a physical blow. Their few possessions lay scattered and broken across the floor. The quilts Annie Mae had so carefully mended were slashed to ribbons, stuffing strewn everywhere. Their winter stores, precious dried meat and beans, had been stolen or trampled into the dirt. Even the small box where Annie Mae kept her mother's Bible was smashed. "Mister." "Gideon?" Annie Mae's tremulous voice came from the doorway. He turned too late to stop her from seeing the wreckage. Her face went chalk white as she took in the destruction, the violation of their small sanctuary. "They mean to drive us out," she whispered. Gideon's jaw clenched. "Gather what you can carry. You're going to stay with Tala at the church until I deal with this. But no arguing." His voice was gentle but firm. "Need to know you're safe while I track these men." Fresh tracks led from the cabin into the hills, at least 3 men, not bothering to hide their trail. They clearly wanted him to follow. Gideon helped Annie Mae salvage what she could into a small bundle, then walked her quickly to town. Tala answered their knock at the church door, taking in their grim faces without question. "Come in, sister," she said to Annie Mae. "We'll find you some warm things." "Keep her close," Gideon told Tala. "Don't let her out of your sight." Tala's dark eyes met his steadily. "No harm will come to her here. Go do what you must." The tracks were easy to follow in the fresh snow. They led up into the rocky slopes above town, where pine forest gave way to scrub and scree. Gideon moved silently through the trees, reading the signs. The men had stopped to rest twice, suggesting they weren't used to mountain travel. Overconfident? Sloppy? He found them in a small clearing, warming their hands over a careless fire. 2 of Morton's hired guns. He recognized them from town. They never saw him coming. One moment they were alone, the next Gideon's knife pressed against the larger man's throat while the other froze, reaching for his pistol. "That's far enough," Gideon said softly, "unless you're eager to bleed." "Just following orders," the smaller man said, hands raised. "Morton pays good money." "Tell Morton this ends now. Next time I catch you near my cabin or the girl, I won't be so gentle." The man with the knife at his throat swallowed carefully. "Won't matter. Boss says if we can't drive you out quiet like, we burn you out. Said to tell you that." Gideon's grip tightened briefly, then he shoved the man away. "Get going. Don't let me find you up here again." They scrambled away through the underbrush, dignity forgotten. But their parting threat lingered like wood smoke. They would return with fire. The afternoon was wearing on by the time Gideon retrieved Annie Mae from the church. Several women had brought food, beans, cornbread, some preserved fruit, small gifts of defiance against Morton's intimidation. "The whole town's talking about what they did to your cabin," Tala said as she helped Annie Mae gather the food. "People are angry, even those who stayed quiet before." The cabin was cold when they returned, the hearth long dead. They worked together in silence, straightening what they could. Annie Mae's face was set with determination as she swept up the stuffing from the ruined quilts. "We should leave," Gideon said finally, watching her. "Find somewhere safer until spring." "No." Annie Mae's voice was firm. "This is my home now. Our home. And that land by the river. That's mine too, my mama's legacy. I won't let them drive us away from it. Could be dangerous, standing our ground." "I know." She looked up at him, chin lifted. "But running won't make us safer. It'll just make us tired. And lonely." She hesitated. Unless you want me to go?" "No," Gideon said roughly. Made you a promise, didn't I? We face it together." Relief softened her features. Outside, the wind was rising, driving the first heavy flakes of snow against the windows. They worked by lantern light, sharing the women's gifted food as darkness settled. The warmth of the rekindled fire gradually drove back the chill, though draft still whistled through the damaged door. "Storm's coming in hard," Gideon observed, studying the thickening snow through the window. "Might keep Morton's men away for a few days at least." "Good," Annie Mae said firmly. "Gives us time to make the cabin strong again." She patted the quilt she was trying to repair. "Everything broken can be mended," my mama always said. "Just takes patience and steady hands." Gideon watched her determined face in the lantern light, remembering her courage at the hearing. She was right. Running would only delay the inevitable. Better to make their stand here, where at least some of the town stood with them. The storm howled outside, sealing them in for what promised to be days of heavy snow. But inside, the cabin glowed with warmth and shared purpose. Together they would rebuild, strengthen their walls against whatever came next. It wasn't the future Gideon had imagined for himself, but watching Annie Mae steadily repair her mother's quilt by firelight, he knew it was right. The storm descended like a white curtain, sealing Gideon and Annie Mae inside their damaged cabin. Wind howled through the gaps they'd stuffed with rags, but the fire burned steady, casting warm light across the wooden walls. 3 days stretched before them, each hour marked by the steady drip of melting snow from the eaves. Gideon found himself sharing knowledge he'd gathered over decades in the mountains. He spread his collection of animal tracks carved in wood across the table, each one a lesson in survival. "See here," he said, running his finger along a carved print. "Rabbit makes these heart-shaped tracks, but fox—" He picked up another carving, leaves a neat line, each foot falling in the print before it. That's how they move so quiet through deep snow. Annie Mae leaned close, her thin fingers tracing the wooden patterns. "Like writing in the snow," she said softly. "God's creatures leaving messages for those who know how to read them." Her way of seeing beauty in practical things stirred something in Gideon's chest. He showed her how to test a knife's edge with her thumb, explaining the angle needed for a clean strike against bone or branch. Her hands were steady as she practiced on his spare blade, though her palms still bore healing marks from the chains. "Careful now," he cautioned, watching her work. "Let the stone do the work. Don't force it." She nodded, adjusting her grip. "Like kneading bread," she said. "Mama always said forcing just makes things tough." The mention of her mother didn't bring tears this time. Instead, a quiet determination showed in her eyes. She was learning to carry her memories like tools rather than wounds. They spent hours by the woodpile, Gideon teaching her to read the grain of logs before splitting them. "Wood's got a story in its rings," he explained. "Tell you which way it'll break if you listen close enough." Annie Mae proved a quick study, her small arms growing more confident with each swing of the lighter axe he'd found for her. When she successfully split a log clean down its heart, her laugh rang bright against the storm's growl. As darkness fell each evening, Annie Mae would take out her mother's Bible, its pages warped from the raiders' destruction, but still readable. Her clear voice gave life to ancient words of comfort and courage. Gideon found himself looking forward to these quiet moments, when psalms of shelter in storms seemed written for their very circumstance. "The Lord is my rock, and my fortress, and my deliverer," she read on the third night, firelight dancing across the pages. "My God, my strength, in whom I will trust." Gideon watched her from his chair by the fire, noticing how the scripture straightened her spine, put color in her cheeks. The words seemed to flow through her like medicine, healing more than just her spirit. They seeped into him too, softening the hard edges grief had carved in his heart. When the storm finally lifted on the fourth morning, they stepped out into a transformed world. Snow lay thick and unmarked around the cabin, Trees bowed under white burden. The sky stretched clear and blue overhead, sun turning the landscape to diamond brightness. Annie Mae's delight at the pristine view lasted only moments. There, nailed to their door, a piece of paper fluttered in the crisp air. Gideon reached it first, his weathered face darkening as he read the crude message. "Next time, fire will finish the job." He crumpled the paper in his fist, but Annie Mae touched his arm. "Let me see," she said quietly. He handed it over, watching her face as she read the threat. Fear flickered in her eyes, but determination won out. "They mean to frighten us away," she said, letting the paper fall to the snow. "But this is our home now. God led us here for a purpose." That evening, as they sat close to the fire, Annie Mae began speaking of her mother's land by the river. Her voice took on a dreaming quality, painting pictures with words. "Mama always said that land was meant for growing things," she said, fingers working at mending a quilt. "Not just crops, but community too." She dreamed of fruit trees lined up like soldiers, their branches heavy with apples and pears. Flowers everywhere, wild roses climbing the fences, sunflowers tall as houses. Gideon listened, seeing the vision form in his mind. "The spring there never runs dry," Annie Mae continued. "Mama said that meant it was meant for sharing. Neighbors welcome to draw water, children playing in the shallow parts in summer." She looked up at Gideon, eyes bright. "A place where people help each other, instead of standing alone." Something shifted in Gideon's chest, like ice breaking up in spring. He'd been defending Annie Mae out of duty and growing affection, but now he saw something larger. A mission worthy of whatever strength he had left, not just protecting a child, but helping build the kind of home that could heal a whole community. He rose before dawn the next morning, testing the edge of his axe against his thumb. The steel rang true as he sharpened it, each stroke purposeful. Annie Mae found him setting traps around the property, not for game this time, but to warn of approaching threats. "Teaching me about tracks wasn't just for hunting, was it?" she asked, watching him work. "No," he admitted. "Need to know if anyone tries sneaking up on us. Especially in the dark." She nodded, understanding. "We'll be ready when they come." "That we will." He straightened, surveying their defenses. "But we're not just protecting ourselves anymore. We're guarding your mama's dream. That land by the river, it's worth fighting for." Annie Mae's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "Worth living for, too," she said softly. "Worth building something new." Gideon nodded, feeling the rightness of their stand settle into his bones. Let Morton and his men come with their fire. They would find more than just a hermit and a rescued girl. They would face a family defending their home, their future, and a vision of community that could transform these mountains. He checked his traps one final time as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow. Each rope and trigger was a promise. To Annie Mae, to her mother's memory, to the better world they meant to build. His hands, so long used to solitary survival, now moved with renewed purpose. The reckoning, when it came, would find them ready. A week passed like spring wind through mountain valleys. The morning sun rose warm against lingering frost as Gideon saddled his old mule. Annie Mae practically danced with excitement, her wool shawl wrapped tight against the remnants of winter chill. "Careful now," Gideon cautioned as he helped her mount behind him. "Trails still icy in patches." The mule picked its way down from their cabin, hooves crunching through crusted snow. Annie Mae's arms circled Gideon's waist, her trust in him as natural as breathing now. The path wound through stands of pine and aspen, their branches dripping with melt. "Tell me again about the river acres," Gideon said, knowing she loved sharing her mother's stories. "Mama said it has the sweetest water in all Colorado territory," Annie Mae replied, her voice bright with anticipation. She'd walk there sometimes, just to sit and listen to it flow. Said it sounded like music. They emerged from the tree line into rolling meadows. The river valley spread before them, a patchwork of snow and exposed earth where winter's grip had loosened. Cottonwoods stood like sentinels along the waterway, their bare branches reaching toward the pearl-gray sky. "There!" Annie Mae pointed eagerly. "See where the river bends?" "That's our land." Gideon guided the mule down the gentle slope. The closer they got, the more the land revealed itself. Rich soil showing dark beneath melting snow, natural terraces that would catch the sun, protected hollows perfect for gardens. He helped Annie Mae dismount, and she immediately pulled off her boots and stockings. Before he could stop her, she ran barefoot through a patch of thawed ground, laughing with pure joy. Her feet left prints in the soft earth, marking her claim more surely than any deed. "Land remembers," Gideon said softly, watching her. "It knows who loves it." Annie Mae spun in a circle, arms outstretched. "Can you see it, Gideon?" The cabin could go right there, up on that rise. We'd have a view of the whole valley, and the morning sun would wake us every day. Gideon walked the site she'd chosen, his experienced eye noting drainage, protection from wind, distance to water. "Good spot," he agreed. "Solid ground for a foundation. Plenty of stone nearby for a chimney." They spent hours walking the property lines, marking where fences would run, where gardens might flourish. Annie Mae's previous fear seemed forgotten as she planned aloud. A chicken coop here, an herb garden there, maybe even a small schoolhouse someday. "Getting ahead of yourself," Gideon chuckled, but his heart warmed at her dreams. The sun rode high when they finally turned back toward town. Annie Mae's cheeks were flushed with excitement and the spring air. At the mercantile, Gideon purchased nails, a new saw, and other tools they'd need for building. The shopkeeper's wife slipped an extra packet of seeds into Annie Mae's pocket with a conspiratorial wink. Outside the store, they met Tala. The young Ute woman's dark eyes crinkled with pleasure at seeing them. From her basket, she drew out a carefully wrapped package. "For you," she told Annie Mae, "to remind you of new beginnings." Annie Mae unwrapped the gift, a kerchief of soft cotton, lovingly embroidered with tiny flowers in bright thread. "Oh, Tala," she breathed, running her fingers over the stitching. "It's beautiful." "Like you," Tala said simply, helping Annie Mae tie it around her neck. "A flower that blooms after storm." Neither of them noticed Morton, the saloon keeper, watching from the shadows of the alley. His face twisted with barely contained rage as he observed their joy. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, knuckles white with fury. The ride home was peaceful, Annie Mae chattering about their plans while Gideon listened contentedly. The tools clinked in their saddlebags, promises of work to come. Evening settled around them as they reached the cabin, painting the snow in shades of rose and purple. "Best day ever," Annie Mae declared as she helped unsaddle the mule. "Get some rest," Gideon told her. "Tomorrow we can start drawing up proper building plans." He stayed outside a while longer, checking his warning traps and securing the mule. The night air carried a hint of spring, but something else too, something that made the hair on his neck rise. He doubled his usual circuits around the cabin before heading in. Annie Mae had already settled on her bunk, Tala's kerchief folded carefully beside her pillow. Gideon banked the fire and stretched out on his own bed, listening to her breathing even out into sleep. The attack came near midnight. The first sign was the crack of breaking glass, followed instantly by whooshing flames. Fire erupted through the cabin's front window, catching the dry timber like tinder. Smoke filled the small space within seconds. "Annie Mae!" Gideon roared, leaping from his bed. "Wake up!" She was already coughing, trying to rise. The flames spread with terrifying speed, feeding on the cabin's aged wood. Heat blasted them as fire climbed the walls. Gideon reached her bunk just as a burning beam crashed down behind them. Annie Mae screamed as sparks showered over them. He saw her hands flash out instinctively to protect her face, catching the worst of the fire. There was no time for gentle. Gideon wrapped her in his blanket and charged toward the door, shoulder first. The wood splintered under his desperate strength. They burst out into the shocking cold of the night. Annie Mae cried out as they fell into the snow. Her hands were already blistering, angry red welts rising on her delicate skin. Gideon rolled her in the snow, extinguishing any remaining sparks on her clothes. "Hold still," he ordered, examining her injuries in the fierce light of the burning cabin. The burns were bad, but thank God, mostly confined to her hands and lower arms. She shook violently, whether from pain or shock he couldn't tell. Behind them, their home became an inferno. The roof collapsed with a tremendous crash, sending a geyser of sparks into the night sky. Heat pulsed against their backs as flames devoured everything they owned. Gideon gathered Annie Mae close, shielding her from both the cold and the sight of destruction. Her tears soaked into his shirt as they watched their world burn to ash. "I've got you," he murmured over and over. "I've got you." The sound of hoofbeats faded into the darkness, but Gideon barely registered them. His entire focus was on the trembling girl in his arms, her burned hands cradled against her chest. Her new kerchief, somehow spared, fluttered at her throat like a defiant flag. They sat there in the snow until the last walls fell, until the flames died down to sullen coals. The cold crept into their bones, but neither moved. Dawn would come soon, bringing new challenges, new decisions. But for now, they simply held each other. Survivors once again. Morning crept over the mountain with cruel indifference. The ruins of Gideon's cabin smoldered in the pale dawn light, wisps of smoke rising like lost spirits into the cold air. Annie Mae sat on an overturned bucket, her burned hands wrapped in strips torn from Gideon's spare shirt. Each throb of pain made her wince, but she kept her spine straight, refusing to bend under this new blow. Gideon moved through the ashes, salvaging what little remained. His hunting knife had survived, along with his mother's old Bible, its edges scorched but its heart intact. Everything else, clothes, tools, food, memories, lay reduced to char and cinder. The destruction was complete, just as the arsonists had intended. "Look here," he said softly, holding up the Bible. Still got his word at least. Annie Mae tried to smile, but her lips trembled. He saves what matters most. The sound of wagon wheels and horses drew their attention. People from town were coming, their shapes dark against the brightening sky. Some faces showed genuine concern, others barely masked curiosity or judgment. Martha Jenkins, the baker's wife, hurried forward with quilts. "You poor dears," she clucked, wrapping one around Annie Mae's shoulders. "Such wickedness to do this." Others brought what they could spare. A pot of coffee, some bread, spare clothes. They formed a circle of warmth around the ruins, sharing what comfort they could offer. Tala appeared with healing salve for Annie Mae's hands, her dark eyes fierce with protective anger. But not everyone came to help. Silas Warner, who owned the feed store, stood apart with several others, their faces hard with disapproval. "Bound to happen," Silas muttered, loud enough to carry. "Man takes in a girl like that, trouble follows natural as rain." "Hush your mouth," Martha snapped, but the damage was done. The whispers spread like poison through the gathering crowd. "Never should have interfered. Girl needs proper guardians." Reckless, pure reckless. Annie Mae hunched smaller under her quilt, each whispered judgment cutting deeper than the burns on her hands. Gideon moved closer to her, his presence a shield against the growing storm of opinion. The crowd parted as Marshal Pike rode up, his face grave. 2 territorial soldiers flanked him, their uniforms dusty from hard riding. Gideon's heart sank at the sight. He'd known this was coming, had felt it in his bones since the first flame touched his cabin. "Gideon," the marshal said, dismounting heavily. Annie May. This is a bad business. Wasn't no accident, Gideon growled. You know who did this? Pike's weathered face showed a flash of something, guilt, perhaps, or shame, but his voice remained official, distant. That's not why I'm here. Got orders from the territorial judge. Until this whole situation gets sorted proper, Annie May needs to be placed in protective custody. No! Annie May stood suddenly, the quilt falling from her shoulders. Please, Marshal. I want to stay with Gideon. It ain't about want, girl. Pike wouldn't meet her eyes. It's about the law. And the law says you need proper supervision, especially now. I am proper supervision. Gideon stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. A burned-out cabin says different. Pike finally looked at him directly. This goes above my head now, Gideon. Judge wants her safe in town until he can review everything. The indenture contract, the land deed, your guardianship claim, everything. The soldiers moved forward, their spurs jingling in the tense silence. One reached for Annie May's arm. Don't touch her hands, Tala warned sharply. They're badly burned. The soldier nodded, gentling his grip. Annie May looked at Gideon, her eyes wide with a fear he hadn't seen since that first day by the wagon tongue. It cut him deeper than any knife. It'll be all right, he tried to tell her, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Please, Annie May whispered, don't let them take me. But there was nothing he could do. The law stood between them now, as solid as a mountain. He watched helplessly as the soldiers led her to a waiting wagon, where Mrs. Jenkins climbed up to ride with her. Small mercies, Gideon thought bitterly. She'll be staying at the Jenkins boarding house, Pike told him. Under guard. You can see her, but only with supervision. The wagon rolled away, Annie May's face growing smaller until it disappeared around the bend. The crowd began dispersing, some offering awkward words of comfort, others simply turning their backs. Soon only Tala remained, standing silent beside him in the ashes. I failed her, Gideon said roughly. Again, just like I failed my Sarah. No, Tala's voice was firm. You gave her love, gave her hope. Those cannot burn. But Gideon barely heard her. The weight of loss pressed down on him like a physical thing, bending his shoulders, aging him years in moments. When Tala finally left, he remained standing in the ruins of his home, surrounded by the wreckage of his second chance at family. Night fell early, bringing with it a fresh snow. The flakes hissed as they met the still warm ashes, gradually softening the harsh edges of destruction. Gideon sat on his burned porch beam, Sarah's Bible in his lap, though he couldn't bring himself to open it. Lord, he whispered into the gathering dark, I ain't been much for praying since you took Sarah, but that girl, she believes in you something fierce. Don't let my failures cost her everything. Please. His voice cracked. The snow continued falling, indifferent to his pain. Each flake that touched his skin felt like judgment, like confirmation of his unworthiness, the strength that had carried him through decades of solitude, through the loss of his wife and child, through countless winter storms. It all seemed to drain away, leaving him hollow. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely voice echoing off the mountainside. Gideon didn't move. The snow began collecting on his shoulders, in his graying hair, but he barely felt the cold. His whole world had narrowed to one thought, one image, Annie May's face as they took her away, wearing the same look of betrayal he'd seen in Sarah's eyes as she died in childbirth, him helpless to save her. The ruins of his cabin disappeared under the growing blanket of white, but Gideon kept his vigil. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, he allowed himself to break, to feel the full measure of his failure. The snow fell steadily, offering no comfort, only silence and cold. He sat there until his tears froze on his cheeks, until the Bible in his lap disappeared under a layer of white, until the last ember of his home finally went dark. Only then did he rise, brush off the snow, and begin planning how to make things right. For Annie Mae, he would find strength again. He had to. Dawn painted the Colorado mountains in shades of pearl and gold, but Gideon noticed none of it. His boots dragged through fresh snow as he made his way into town, his shoulders stooped with exhaustion. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, couldn't, with Annie Mae taken from him. The streets were quiet, except for the crunch of his footsteps and the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. His face was rough with stubble, his clothes still smelling of smoke. A few early risers hurried past, averting their eyes from his desperate state. Marshal Pike stood outside his office, as if expecting him. The lawman's hand rested casually on his holstered pistol. "Need to see her," Gideon growled, his voice hoarse from the night's cold. "Can't let you do that, Gideon." Pike's tone was firm, but held a note of sympathy. "Judge's orders are clear. No unsupervised visits." "She needs me!" Gideon took a step forward, his fists clenching. Pike's hand tightened on his gun. "Don't make this worse than it is. Girl's safe. That's what matters." "Safe?" Gideon's laugh was bitter. "She was safe with me until your law looked the other way while they burned my cabin." A small crowd began gathering, drawn by the tension between the two men. Among them, Tala moved quietly closer, her dark eyes watchful. As Pike and Gideon faced each other, she slipped something into Gideon's coat pocket, smooth and light, like paper. "Go home, Gideon," Pike said wearily. "Get some rest. We'll sort this proper when the judge arrives." "Ain't got a home anymore," Gideon replied, but he turned away, his hand brushing against the note in his pocket. Once out of sight, he pulled out the folded paper. Tala's neat writing told him what he needed to know. Annie Mae wasn't at the boarding house as they'd said. She was being kept at the preacher's parsonage, under guard. His heart lifted slightly. The preacher's wife was a kind woman. At least Annie Mae would be treated gently there. He found Tala waiting by the frozen river, where ice stretched like clouded glass between the banks. She acknowledged him with a slight nod, then knelt in the snow to pray. After a moment's hesitation, Gideon joined her. "Great Spirit," Tala began in her quiet way, "guide this father's heart." Gideon's voice cracked as he spoke. "Lord, I'm scared. Scared of failing her like I failed Sarah. Scared of watching another daughter slip away while I stand helpless." His shoulders shook. "Why give me this chance if you meant to take it back?" Tala's hand touched his arm lightly. "The Creator does not give to take away. He gives to teach us trust." "Trust?" Gideon's laugh was harsh. "What about when Sarah died? When our baby never drew breath? Where was trust then?" "Perhaps it waited," Tala said softly, "in a young girl who needed a father's love." At the parsonage, Annie Mae sat in a small room, her bandaged hands folded in her lap. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Henderson, brought her a bowl of steaming soup. "You need to eat, child," Mrs. Henderson urged. "You'll make yourself ill." Annie Mae shook her head. "Not until I see Gideon." "The marshal says—" "The marshal isn't my father," Annie Mae interrupted, then added more softly. "Gideon is. God chose him for me, same as he chose my mother." Mrs. Henderson sat beside her, concern creasing her kind face. "Your loyalty does you credit, dear, but surely you see this situation isn't proper." Annie Mae's chin lifted. "What isn't proper is selling children for whiskey. What isn't proper is burning homes and splitting families." Her voice grew stronger. "Gideon saved me. He taught me to trap rabbits and split wood. He lets me read the Bible every night, just like Mama did. That's more proper than anything else that's happened to me since she died." The older woman studied her face. "You truly believe God sent him to you?" "I know it," Annie Mae said simply. "Same as I know the sun rises, and I won't eat until I see him." As evening approached, Gideon found himself wandering the snowy hills above town. The setting sun painted long shadows across the white landscape, and his breath frosted in the cooling air. He walked without direction, speaking aloud to the empty mountains. "Why, Lord? Why send her to me?" His voice echoed off stone faces. "Was it just to remind me what I lost? To show me what I can't protect?" The wind whistled through pine branches, carrying ice crystals that stung his face. He thought of Annie Mae reading scripture by lamplight, her voice clear and steady despite her fears. What was that verse she loved so much? As if in answer, the wind seemed to carry her voice. "I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee." Gideon stopped, the words hitting him like a physical blow. She'd read that passage their first night together, when she was still trembling from the cold and fear. He'd thought she was trying to comfort herself, but now he wondered if she'd been trying to reach him even then. He stood there, as darkness crept across the snow, remembering how she'd swept his cabin though her hands were raw, how she'd laughed while learning to set snares, how she'd dreamed of fruit trees on her mother's land. She hadn't given up on him, even when the whole town doubted. The mountains offered no answers to his questions, but their silence felt different now. Not empty, but waiting. Like the pause between one breath and the next. Like the moment before dawn. Fresh snow began to fall as Gideon made his way back toward town. He couldn't see the parsonage from here, but he knew Annie Mae was there, probably still refusing food, still believing in him when he barely believed in himself. "I hear you, girl," he whispered to the dark. "I ain't forsaking you either." The snow continued falling, covering his tracks almost as soon as he made them. But for the first time since the fire, his steps were steady, purposeful. Annie Mae's faith might be the thing that saved them both. Morning sunlight glinted off fresh snow as Tala made her way to the marshal's office. Her moccasins left quiet prints in the white powder, and her breath clouded in the crisp air. She carried a small leather pouch close to her heart, filled with papers that weighed heavy with truth. Marshal Pike looked up from his desk as she entered, his weathered face showing mild surprise. "Something I can help you with?" Tala stood straight, her dark eyes steady. "There are matters you must hear, Marshal." "About the saloon keeper." Pike's expression hardened. "If this is about the Callahan girl—" "This is about many girls," Tala interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. She drew several folded papers from her pouch. "Written testimony from White River women about children traded for whiskey." The marshal's chair creaked as he leaned back. "Indian testimony don't carry much weight in territorial court." "Truth carries weight," Tala said, laying the papers on his desk. 3 summers ago, 2 girls disappeared from our camp. We found them in his cellar, sick from drink. She placed another paper down. "Last winter, a mother searched 4 days for her son. He was found in a mining camp, sold for 3 bottles. Pike's fingers drummed against his desk. "That's just talk." "Talk that echoes through many camps." Tala's voice grew stronger. "The White River agent signed these papers. He knows the saloon keeper's reputation." Outside the office window, townspeople passed by, some slowing to peer inside. Word would spread fast in a town this size. Tala could already see curiosity and concern on their faces. "Even if these stories are true," Pike said, "they're outside my jurisdiction." "Like Annie Mae was outside your protection?" Tala's words cut sharp as winter wind. "How many children must vanish before law sees truth?" The marshal's face flushed. "Now see here!" But Tala was already moving towards the door. "I leave these for you to read. The truth does not change because you look away." She stepped outside, hearing whispers start among the gathered townspeople. Seeds of truth, once planted, had their own way of growing. That evening, as purple shadows crept across the snow, Gideon moved like a ghost through the darkness. His boots made no sound as he approached the parsonage, staying close to the shadows of bare trees and wooden fences. A single lamp burned in an upstairs window. He knew that's where they kept Annie Mae. He'd watched the house all day from a distance. Now, in the quiet of night, he drew closer than he'd dared before. Her voice drifted down, soft but clear. Lord, protect Gideon tonight. Keep his heart strong when he's alone, and help the marshal see what's right, even if he's scared to stand against wrong. Gideon's throat tightened. Here she was, locked away, and still she prayed for others. Still she believed in mercy. He could break in. The thought tempted him fierce as thirst in summer. One broken window, one kicked-in door. That's all it would take to reach her. But that would make him the outlaw they claimed he was, would shame her faith in him. A floorboard creaked inside the house. Gideon melted back into the shadows, his heart aching. He couldn't help her by breaking the law. Had to be another way. He retreated through the darkness, Annie Mae's prayers following him like stars he couldn't quite reach. Morning brought a bustle of activity to the church. The preacher had called a town meeting, and people arrived in twos and threes, stamping snow from their boots in the entrance. Ranch wives in their best shawls, miners still dusty from their shifts, even a few Ute families who traded regularly in town. Gideon stood at the back, his presence drawing uncertain glances. The marshal leaned against one wall, arms crossed. Near the front, Tala sat with several White River women, their faces calm but determined. The preacher stood before his pulpit, holding up a worn piece of paper. Friends and neighbors, I hold here a legal deed. 40 acres of river bottom, registered to Sarah Beth Callahan, Annie Mae's mother. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The preacher continued, his voice carrying to every corner. This deed, properly recorded with the territory, names Annie Mae as sole heir. By law, she owns that land free and clear. She's still a minor, the marshal cut in. Can't claim property without a guardian. That's right, called someone from the crowd. Need a proper family to look after her. And who decides what's proper? A ranch wife stood up, her gray hair tucked neatly under a bonnet. That saloon keeper who burns cabins with children inside. Another woman rose. My Henry saw those men leaving Gideon's place that night, carrying oil cans bold as brass. Where was the law then, Marshal? Pike shifted uncomfortably. Can't prove who set that fire. Like you can't prove those Indian children were sold for whiskey? This from a third woman, her voice sharp with scorn. We all heard the testimony Tala brought. How many more children have to suffer while you look the other way? The marshal's face reddened. Now see here. No, you see here! The first ranch wife stepped forward, her spine straight as a fence post. I watched my sister's girl die in a mining camp, worked to death before she was 12. Saw the same look in Annie Mae's eyes that day Gideon cut her loose. You want to send her back to that? The preacher held up his hands for quiet. The question before us is simple. Will this town stand for justice or hide behind excuses? Annie Mae has land, has a guardian who's proven he'll protect her, has skills to make a proper home. What more does the law require? Pike pushed off from the wall. Law requires order. Can't have people taking justice into their own hands. Sometimes, Tala said softly, rising to her feet, justice must first grow in human hearts before it can live in human laws. The marshal looked around the church. Faces stared back at him, some angry, some pleading, all expecting him to choose. He'd worn his badge a long time, built his authority on compromise and looking away. But compromising with evil was its own kind of lawlessness. Reckon, he said slowly, a town meeting like this carries some weight. Could write to the territorial judge, tell him the community supports the girl's claim and her choice of guardian. Relief swept through the room like a warm wind. The preacher nodded, satisfaction clear on his face. I believe that would be the righteous course, Marshal." Gideon stayed silent, but his eyes burned with unshed tears. The town was choosing justice, choosing Annie Mae, choosing to believe in something bigger than fear. The meeting continued, details being worked out, but the tide had turned. Law would follow the path that mercy had already blazed. Outside the church, snow began falling again, soft and steady, covering the old tracks and making way for new ones to be laid. The church door slammed open, winter wind howling through like Judgment Day. The saloon-keeper stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his right hand hovered near the pistol on his hip. "Bunch of fools, the lot of you," he snarled, stalking down the center aisle. "That mountain hermit's filled your heads with lies." People drew back from his fury, pressing against the wooden pews. Mothers pulled children close. The warm spirit of moments before froze like creek water in January. Gideon stepped away from the back wall, his weathered face calm. He wore no weapon, just his old leather coat still smelling of smoke from his burned cabin. "No one's been fooled," Gideon said quietly. "Truth's got a way of coming clear, like spring water through mountain snow." The saloon-keeper spat on the church floor. "Truth? You stole my property. That girl belonged to me, fair and legal. Then you turned the town against me with your preaching and carrying on." "Annie Mae belongs to no one but God," Gideon declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "She's a child of His creation, same as any soul here." Pretty words from a hermit who can't even keep a roof over her head. The saloon-keeper's hand gripped his pistol grip. "Where was your God when your cabin burned?" A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Until now, no one had dared name him as the fire starter so directly. Tala rose from her bench, a leather folder clutched in her hands. "The same place he was when you sold White River children to the mining camps," she said clearly. Watching, remembering. The saloon-keeper's face went pale, then red. "You shut your mouth, squaw." "No," Tala said, stepping into the aisle. "These papers will speak instead." She opened the folder, drawing out several documents. Affidavits from the Indian agent at White River, testimonies from families, receipts for whiskey traded to drunken men for their children's labor contracts. She handed the papers to the preacher, who began reading with growing horror. Dates, names, witnesses, 3 children sold to the Carson mine, 2 girls traded to a Kansas City brothel. "Lies." The saloon-keeper drew his pistol, waving it wildly. "Indian tales, nothing more." But Tala wasn't finished. From the folder she pulled more papers. "The territorial marshal in Denver has been building a case, tracking children who disappeared across county lines, all leading back to your saloon." The preacher's face hardened as he read. "These are federal documents, witness statements from mining camp operators, stage drivers, even your own barman." "Arrest him!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Child stealing's a hanging offense." The saloon-keeper spun, pistol shaking. "Keep back! I'll shoot the first person who touches me." Marshal Pike pushed away from the wall, his own hand near his gun, but he hesitated, caught between old loyalties and new truth. "Your choice, Marshal," the preacher said quietly. "Stand with justice or stand with evil. No middle ground here." Townsfolk began moving forward, faces set with determination. Ranch wives who'd lost nieces to mining camps, miners who'd seen children worked to death, Ute mothers whose children had vanished into winter nights. Their combined courage pressed like a wave against the marshal's uncertainty. "Last chance, Pike," the saloon-keeper screamed. "Do your job." "I aim to!" The marshal drew his revolver in one smooth motion. "Drop that gun! You're under arrest for child trafficking, arson, and attempted murder!" For one terrible moment, the saloon-keeper's finger tightened on his trigger. Then his shoulders slumped. The pistol clattered to the floor. "Cuff him," Pike ordered 2 deputies. "Send a wire to Denver. Tell them we've got their child seller." As the deputies led the saloon-keeper away, the church door opened again. Annie Mae stood there, the preacher's wife, behind her. She'd heard the commotion from the parsonage. Her eyes found Gideon immediately. With a cry that was half sob, half joy, she ran down the aisle. Soot still stained her cheeks from the cabin fire, and tears cut clean tracks through the marks as she threw herself into Gideon's arms. "You're free now, child," he whispered, holding her close. "Free as God meant you to be." "Don't leave me," she pleaded into his coat. Gideon's voice grew husky with emotion. "Never again, Annie Mae. You've got my word before God and these witnesses. You'll never be alone again." The preacher stepped forward, laying one hand on Annie Mae's shoulder and one on Gideon's. "The Lord sets the lonely in families," he quoted softly. "Looks to me like he's done just that here." Tala gathered her papers, smiling through her own tears. Around them, the congregation began to move, offering congratulations, promises of help rebuilding, welcome to their new neighbors. Outside, the snow continued falling, but inside the church, hearts burned warm with justice, served and love triumphant. Annie Mae kept her arms wrapped tight around Gideon, as if afraid he might disappear. But his strong hands held her just as firmly, sheltering her at last in the safety of true family. The marshal paused at the door, looking back. "Reckon I owe you an apology, Gideon. Both of you." "No need," Gideon replied. "Just see justice done from here on." Pike nodded slowly. "That I will." He touched his hat brim and walked out into the snowy morning, leaving father and daughter embracing in the light streaming through the church windows. Annie Mae looked up at Gideon, her eyes shining with hope. "Can we go see our land now? Start planning where to build?" "First thing tomorrow," he promised, smoothing her hair. "Got some good folks offering to help raise a proper cabin this time." She smiled, bright as sunrise on mountain snow. "Then we're really home." "Home," Gideon agreed, the word feeling like a prayer in his mouth. "By God's grace and mercy, we're finally home." Spring arrived in full force, turning the mountain roads into ribbons of thick mud. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the church, a small caravan of wagons creaked their way toward Annie Mae's river acres. The wheels sank deep in the muck, but hope drove them forward as steadily as the oxen. Gideon sat tall in the lead wagon, handling the reins with practiced ease. Beside him, Annie Mae pointed excitedly at each new sight, a pair of bluebirds darting through budding cottonwoods, fresh grass pushing through melting snow patches, the glint of river water ahead. "Look there," she called out, tugging Gideon's sleeve. "Those flat rocks by the bend, perfect for washing clothes come summer." Tala rode behind them in the second wagon, surrounded by stacks of fresh-cut timber donated by the sawmill. Her dark eyes sparkled with amusement at Annie Mae's enthusiasm. Other wagons followed, loaded with supplies from townspeople who had finally chosen to stand on the side of justice: nails, tools, windows, door hinges, and even a cast-iron cookstove. When they reached the building site Gideon had chosen, a gentle rise overlooking the river, everyone pitched in to unload. Annie Mae tried to lift a board despite her still healing hands, but Gideon gently took it from her. "Your time's coming for the heavy work," he said softly. "For now you can be our architect. Tell us where everything should go." She nodded, though he could see the frustration in her eyes. But then she straightened her shoulders and began directing traffic like a general commanding troops. "The door should face east," she declared, "so the morning sun will wake us. And windows on the south wall to catch the warm light all day long." Tala moved to stand beside her, pointing toward the river. "Good choice. The Ute people always build with the sun in mind. It brings strength to a home." The men began marking out the cabin's foundation, driving stakes into the soft spring earth. Women from town arrived with baskets of food, bread still warm from morning baking, jars of preserved fruit, smoked venison, and coffee in big tin pots. Several children tagged along, carrying bundles of early spring flowers they had gathered along the way. Annie Mae's face lit up when they asked where to plant them. "Along the riverbank," she suggested, "so we can see them from the porch we're going to build." The children scattered eagerly, digging small holes with sticks and carefully setting in clumps of purple violets, yellow buttercups, and white mountain daisies. Their laughter mixed with the sound of hammers and saws as the cabin's bones began to rise. Tala took Annie Mae aside during a break in the activity. They walked to a flat piece of ground near where the garden would be, and Tala began drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "These are the old ways of planting," she explained. "Corn in the center, beans to climb the corn stalks, squash below to shade the soil, the three sisters working together as family should." Annie Mae watched intently, her fingers tracing the designs. "Will you teach me more?" "About your people's ways of living on the land?" "I will teach you everything I know," Tala promised, "and you will teach me things too." That is how wisdom grows, like a healthy garden, many different plants making the soil richer together. By midday, the cabin's floor joists were laid and wall frames began rising against the blue spring sky. Gideon moved among the workers, checking joints, adjusting angles, making sure everything was plumb and square. But his weathered face held something new, the shadow of a smile that kept breaking through his usual serious expression. When the first wall frame stood complete, Annie Mae couldn't contain herself. She ran to help steady the next one, gritting her teeth against the sting in her palms. "Careful now," Gideon cautioned, but he didn't stop her. He saw the determination in her eyes and recognized it, the need to help build one's own future. The afternoon wore on as walls rose one by one. Women stretched clotheslines between trees to hang quilts, creating shade for the workers. Children fetched water from the river in buckets, serving drinks to thirsty builders. The whole scene hummed with community spirit that had been missing from the town for too long. As the sun began its westward slide, the roof beams were ready to raise. This was always the trickiest part of cabin building, requiring many hands working in perfect coordination. The heavy timbers had to be lifted and settled just right, or the whole roof wouldn't sit true. "Ready now?" called the lead carpenter. "Everyone together." Ropes creaked and muscles strained as the main ridge beam rose slowly into the air. Gideon took his place at one end, guiding the massive log toward its resting place. Suddenly the beam shifted unexpectedly. Several men grunted with effort, trying to control it. "Steady!" Gideon shouted. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to laugh, a deep, rolling sound that hadn't passed his lips in decades. The beam settled perfectly into place as his laughter rang out across the river acres. Annie Mae stared at him in wonder. She had never heard him laugh before. The sound seemed to break something loose in the air, and soon others were laughing too, from relief, from joy, from the simple pleasure of working together toward something good. The rest of the roof frame went up quickly after that. As dusk began to gather, the last beam was secured. Tala led a prayer of thanksgiving, mixing Ute words with English ones, asking the Creator to bless this house and all who would find shelter within its walls. Then came the moment Annie Mae had dreamed of since first seeing the land deed, building the first fire in their very own hearth. The stone fireplace stood ready, crafted by skilled hands from river rock and clay mortar. Gideon showed her how to lay the kindling just so, how to stack the logs to draw the smoke up properly. Together they struck the match and touched it to the dry grass nest they had prepared. The flame caught quickly, spreading to the twigs above, then to the larger branches. Soon, a proper fire danced in the firebox, casting its warm light across the newly laid floorboards. Annie Mae knelt before the hearth, her face glowing in the firelight. Tears sparkled in her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude now, not fear or pain. Gideon stood behind her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. Tala sat nearby, adding a handful of sacred herbs to the flames that filled the air with sweet smoke. "Thank you," Annie Mae whispered, though whether to Gideon, to Tala, to the townspeople still cleaning up outside, or to God above, no one could say for certain. Perhaps she meant it for all of them. The fire crackled softly, speaking its own language of welcome and warmth. Through the empty window frames they could see the river flowing past, its waters turned to liquid gold by the setting sun. The newly planted flowers along its banks nodded in the evening breeze, as if approving all that had been accomplished this day. There was still much work ahead, walls to chink, windows to glaze, furniture to build, but the heart of the home was beating now, strong and steady as Annie Mae's own heart, finally feeling safe enough to dream of tomorrow. The evening settled softly around the new cabin, wrapping it in gentle spring shadows. Through the freshly glazed windows, warm lamplight spilled across the river like molten gold, marking this place as home. Inside, the hearth crackled with contentment, sending sweet-scented wood smoke up the stone chimney that Gideon and the townsmen had built with such care. Annie Mae sat cross-legged on a braided rug before the fire, her mother's Bible open in her lap. Her hands, still bearing the marks of her ordeal, moved carefully across the well-worn pages. The firelight caught the silvery scars on her palms, but they no longer pained her much. Like the land itself, she was healing. Gideon settled into the chair he'd crafted from river willow, tamping tobacco into his pipe with practiced motions. Its familiar scent mingled with the wood smoke as he watched Annie Mae's fingers trace the lines of scripture. Those same hands had helped hang the cabin's door just yesterday, refusing to be babied despite their scars. Tala sat nearby on a low stool, weaving a basket from fresh reeds. Her quick fingers moved steadily, binding the strands together just as she had helped bind their unlikely family into something strong and new. "Shall I read the 23rd Psalm?" Annie Mae asked, looking up. The lamplight caught her face, showing how it had filled out these past weeks with regular meals and peace of mind. "That's a good one," Gideon nodded, his voice gruff with emotion he still struggled to express. He remembered how she had quoted it that first night, hurt and frightened in his old cabin. Now her voice rang clear and confident in their new home. "The Lord is my shepherd," Annie Mae began, the ancient words flowing smooth as the river outside. "I shall not want." Gideon closed his eyes, letting her voice wash over him. Who would have thought that morning in town, when he'd cut her free from those chains, that God had bigger plans than just a rescue? He'd gained more than a ward to protect. He'd found his daughter. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," Annie Mae continued. "He leadeth me beside the still waters." The rush of the river provided a gentle counterpoint to her words. Through the window, Gideon could see the newly planted garden where Tala had shown them how to plant the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash growing together as nature intended. Like them, he thought. Different as could be, but stronger together. "He restoreth my soul," Annie Mae read, and Gideon felt the truth of it deep in his bones. His soul had been restored, brought back from the wasteland of grief and solitude by this child's trust and courage. Tala's fingers stilled on her basket as she listened. "The Creator speaks through many voices," she said softly when Annie Mae finished. "Through Scripture, through the land, through the hearts of those who become family by choice rather than blood." "Reckon that's true enough," Gideon agreed, drawing on his pipe. The smoke curled up like prayers in the quiet room. "Law tried to say you were property, Annie Mae, but God had other notions." Annie Mae closed the Bible carefully, running her scarred fingers over its leather cover. "The law was wrong," she said simply. "You and Tala and the townspeople who helped us, You all proved that family is stronger than any paper contract. Tala nodded, her dark eyes warm. You are my kin now, both of you. The Ute people know that family is not always about whose blood runs in your veins, but whose love runs in your heart. Outside, the river's song grew louder as evening deepened into night. It seemed to speak of renewal, of winter's grip finally broken, of new life surging green and hopeful from the warming earth. Like the land itself, they had all been transformed by love's patient work. Gideon found himself blinking back moisture from his eyes. He'd thought his heart was frozen solid after losing his wife and baby all those years ago. But Annie Mae had thawed it out, teaching him to care again, to believe in something bigger than survival. He bowed his head, whispering words of gratitude to the God who had seen fit to give him a second chance at fatherhood. The pipe smoke rose like incense in the quiet room, carrying his thanks heavenward. Annie Mae watched him, her face glowing with more than just firelight. She set the Bible aside carefully and stood, moving to stand beside his chair. Her hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. "We're home, Pa," she said softly, the word Pa falling from her lips as natural as breathing. Gideon's heart swelled near to bursting. He covered her hand with his own, feeling the scars beneath his fingers, badges of courage that had led them both to this moment. No more running, no more fear. Just family gathered close around the hearth of their own making. The lamplight flickered, casting their shadows on the walls of the home they'd built together. Outside, the river rolled on under the rising moon, its waters singing of renewal, of winter's end, of love's triumph over fear and greed. Inside, 3 hearts beat as one, bound together by something stronger than law or blood, the courage to choose family, to choose love, to choose hope. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.